Welcome. My name is Craig Svensson, and this is the Faith Community Institute class entitled Help for Those Living with Chronic Illness and Pain. We are glad you have joined us for this journey, which is planned to take 10 weeks. The objective of this class is pretty straightforward and shown here on this slide. It is to provide you with some practical and biblical help if you are living with the pain and suffering that comes with chronic illness. Or perhaps you are not suffering from chronic illness yourself, but you desire to be better able to minister to someone who is. That might be a family member, that might be friends, it might be people in your church. I trust that you will find this class to give you some tools to be able to do that. A good starting point is for me to answer the question, why me? Why was I asked to teach this FCI class on this particular topic? Well, you can see from this slide professional affiliations. I'm associated with the Purdue University College of Pharmacy and the Indiana University School of Medicine. I have devoted my professional career to biomedical research, as well as preparing the next generation of health professionals, pharmacists, physicians, nurses, and physician assistants in particular. So the area of health and issues related to health are obviously in my bailiwick. But in addition to having a general interest in issues related to health because of my professional training and professional responsibilities, this is also an area of scholarly interest for me. I have spent a lot of time interacting with the literature on how patients respond to chronic illness and what we can do to help them to thrive in the midst of that illness. In addition to that, this is also an area that I have a little bit of personal experience with, having accumulated several incurable chronic illnesses myself over the years. And let me tell you a little bit about that experience, because that will help you, number one, understand the perspective that I bring to this, but it will also help you understand that when I talk about issues related to chronic illness, I'm not talking about them simply from a detached professional experience, but also from having walked that journey to some degree myself. Shortly after my wife and I were married, I was diagnosed with a rare form of colitis. And that really left me with attacks, sometimes as frequently as 4 times a week, that were rather debilitating. And that was our experience for the first 15 years of our marriage. About 15 years into that journey, we were finally able to identify a medication that brought it under reasonable control. I still struggle with it from time to time, but nowhere near as the intensity of our first 15 years of marriage. But right at that same time that I was able to find something to help with my colitis, I injured my back. And that was in 1998. And it left me with very debilitating back pain every day. For me, the worst thing was sitting. So just getting in the car going to work was excruciatingly painful. For quite some period of time, I just didn't travel unless I absolutely had to because it was too painful. I couldn't do those kind of normal chores that you would do around the house. The first 10 years of that journey with chronic pain, I'll acknowledge, were really hard, and they changed the way we lived life significantly. Fortunately, the last 10 years have been a bit better. I don't know how much of that is because the pain has decreased, and I found some ways of trying to be able to manage it better, or how much of it is I've just gotten used to living with chronic pain. But it's a good thing that happened, because shortly before I came to Purdue University in 2006 to assume the role of Dean of the College of Pharmacy, Nursing, and Health Sciences, I started developing some strange neurological symptoms, which ultimately by the fall of 2007 were diagnosed as multiple sclerosis. I'm very fortunate in that my multiple sclerosis manifests itself purely in sensory ways. It has not impaired my functional ability, but rather I'm left with areas of my body that burn, tingle, or feel like they're contracting. Each time I've had a relapse of MS, it has left something residual that never goes away, that I feel this pain or this burning and tingling in different parts of my body literally every day. There's some days they're worse, other days they're better, but they're always there. Now, I say all of that not to gain your pity, But to help you recognize that I do understand a little bit about what it's like to live with a chronic illness for which there is no cure, an illness that alters in some ways how you live life. And I actually wrote a book that you can see on this screen here entitled When There Is No Cure, How to Thrive While Living with the Pain and Suffering of Chronic Illness. And this book really weaves my personal experience and my scholarly interest together. Each chapter begins with a vignette from my own personal experience about issues related to chronic illness, and then goes through the literature that talk about ways that we can deal with those particular issues, like dealing with troubling diagnosis, how you make decisions about what therapies to take or what not to take, how you deal with people who say things that are hurtful because they don't understand the illness that you're going through. Maybe a third to about a half of the material that we cover in these sessions ahead will be in this book, and the other portions are not. You don't need to buy the book to go through this course. I think you might find it as a helpful companion in your own journey. I guess I should say, so this doesn't sound like a self-serving advertisement, that the royalties for this book go to support a scholarship for pharmacy students at Purdue. So whether you buy the book or not, I will not gain financially. But I hope if you choose to buy it, you would find it helpful in your journey. It was the publication of this book that led Pastor Folden to ask if I would be willing to teach this FCI class. And I'd like to give you an overview of the topics that we will be covering in the weeks ahead. The first two sessions, we're going to talk about chronic illness in general. I want to give you a broad perspective of chronic illness with some particular focus on chronic pain. I do believe that chronic pain deserves some special attention, and many people misunderstand chronic pain. So I'd like to start out by talking a bit about chronic pain and how it differs. Those topics will cover the first two sessions. And then we're going to talk about dealing with difficult medical issues. Anybody who lives with chronic illness is from time to time going to face challenges in medical decisions that they have to make. And so we'll plan to spend 3 sessions on these topics. And some of these issues actually arise from feedback I've gotten from people who have read the book or other talks that I have given on this topic. And then we're going to focus on 2 sessions specifically on spiritual challenges that arise when you live with chronic suffering. This is such an important area to recognize, that living with a chronic illness will present significant spiritual challenges in your life. It's important to know how to address those. And then we'll spend 2 sessions on how people can be of practical help to those living with chronic illness. Well, I think this will especially be focused to those of you who are listening in that don't live with chronic illness yourself, but want to know how to minister to others. I think you'll also find it helpful if you're living with chronic illness. It'll give you perhaps some insight into how you can talk to others about how they might help you, but it will also help you think about ways that you can be of assistance to others who are walking through a chronic illness journey. And then right now, the last session is a little bit up in the air. I'll talk about this in a moment, but we might devote the time to question and answers. So if we get enough questions submitted, I'll devote the last session to just answering those questions. Or if not, I have a special topic that I will prepare and cover for the last session. The process that we'll use for each class is outlined here on this slide. Each session is going to be about 25 to 35 minutes long. For those of you who began with us in the live session before the pandemic struck, you know that those sessions were a little bit different. We normally have our FCI classes last about 90 minutes. But we felt that would be a little too long to have people sit and listen to recorded sessions. In fact, when the pandemic struck at Purdue University, we went to all online education. And that meant we pre-recorded lectures and put them up for students to listen to. And one of the feedback we got from students was how very difficult it is to try to listen to an hour-long class that's recorded. In fact, students said it's much harder than sitting in class for that length of time. And so in speaking with Pastor Folden, what we decided to do was to make these considerably shorter than we normally would for the time frame for an FCI class, but make them longer in weeks. So instead of 6 weeks, we're going to do it for 10 weeks, and each session will be about 30 minutes long, give or take. They'll be posted at least the day before the session would normally be scheduled, but they will be enduring, so they'll be posted there. You could listen to them at the time that we would normally have scheduled our FCI class, 6:30 on Wednesday nights, or since they'll be posted, you can listen to them anytime that they will be convenient to you. You can even, if you choose, to do a binge listening at the end of the 10 weeks if you choose to go that route. In addition to these video sessions that will be posted, there also will be a handout, and that handout will include a general outline as well as some recommended resources, and those will be posted as a PDF along with the recordings. As I indicated just a few moments ago, I also want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Since this isn't a live session, obviously the way to do that would be if you would to submit to me your questions. And you can see my email address here. It's just my last name, Svensson@purdue.edu. And I'll collect these over the weeks that we have these sessions. And if there's enough of them, what I'll do is I'll devote the very last session to answering the questions that you have submitted. So feel free to submit them at any time. Probably the sooner the better. It will give me a sense of whether or not there's enough questions to devote that last session, or whether I'll prepare a special topic for that final session. With the time that remains for today's session, I really want to try to address two key questions. First, what is the frequency of chronic illness? How many people are we talking about? What type of illnesses are there that people are living with? And then second, how does living with pain impact a person's overall health? This is an infographic that was created by the Centers for Disease Control, which is the main body in the United States that collects comprehensive information about diseases. And you can see from this infographic that the CDC estimates that about 50% of adults are living with some type of chronic disease. And 1 in 4 have 2 or more chronic diseases. And that it makes a tremendous contribution to the $2.7 trillion in annual healthcare costs that our country spends. And of course, there's lots of big diseases: heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, etc. Chronic illness is common, but not all chronic illness results in suffering. And I think it's important to differentiate the two of those. For example, individuals who are living with high blood pressure or hypertension generally would not say that their illness creates suffering in their life. It might be annoying to have to remember to take medication. There may even be some occasionally uncomfortable side effects that are associated with those medications. It may disrupt their schedule a little bit from time to time to have appointments for follow-up. But people with hypertension generally wouldn't tell you that the disease causes suffering in their life. On the other hand, people who are living with fibromyalgia or Parkinson's disease or multiple sclerosis would tell you that their disease has produced suffering. It's estimated that about 25% of people with a chronic illness have an illness that limits daily activity. And by daily activity, meaning things that they would normally do, whether it's related to things around the house or activities associated with work. The diseases that are most associated with suffering are what we call degenerative diseases. Degenerative diseases, by their nature, are progressive. They're usually irreversible, and they result in a progressive decline in health and function over time. So when somebody has been diagnosed with a degenerative disease, they know two things. What they have is incurable. It's going to journey with them for the rest of their life. And secondly, they know things are going to get worse. Their health will deteriorate over time. That's a tough diagnosis to receive. To know you have something that can't be cured, and then it's going to make you worse over the years to come. This slide illustrates for you something of the magnitude of a number of the diseases that are associated with suffering. The largest of these, of course, is arthritis, that is estimated to impact over 50 million people in America. It can result in severe declines in mobility and substantial pain. And then there's migraine. It's estimated that about 40 million people in America suffer with migraine. In fact, globally, when you look at the burden of various diseases, migraine consistently ranks as about number 6. It's always in the top 10, but usually it's number 6 in the global burden of disease. Now, migraine can range anything from someone who gets a couple of migraines a year to individuals who suffer debilitating migraine attacks several times a week. And then you have the large category of fibromyalgia. It's difficult to tell just what the true numbers of fibromyalgia are, and in a subsequent session I'll talk a little bit for the reason for that, but a common estimate is about 10 million people suffer from fibromyalgia. And then you have inflammatory bowel diseases, or IBD, and lupus, that each impact about 1.5 million people. And then there is the degenerative diseases that are most widely thought of, and that is multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease, that each impact 1 million. And then sandwiched in the middle here, I have epilepsy, which impacts about 3.5 million people. Now, epilepsy normally is not degenerative. Sometimes it is in special cases, but it certainly can have a profound impact on people's ability to live life, their ability to work, their ability to enjoy certain types of leisure activities, their ability to even drive. In addition to these big diseases, there are also a number of rare diseases. In fact, it's estimated that there are about 7,000 rare diseases. A rare disease is a disease that afflicts 200,000 or fewer people in the population. But when you add all these diseases together, that comprises about 25 to 30 million Americans. And one of the challenges about having a rare disease is that over 90% of them have no approved therapy. In other words, there's nothing that has been clearly demonstrated to either treat the symptoms, slow progression, and certainly not to cure the disease. You know, one of the common complaints about people that have a rare disease is that people question the validity of their diagnosis. People that have a rare disease will tell you of the experience of someone asking them, well, what's wrong with you? And they'll name this unusual disease they have. And they will tell you they often get a response of people questioning the validity of their disease, as though, well, if I've never heard of it, it must not be a real disease, right? This is a common experience of people, and they struggle with it when they tell other people that they have a rare disease and what that rare disorder is. There's an interesting consortium in Europe that has actually tried to assess the impact of rare disease on people that have this experience or people who care for them. They refer to those as carers. We would use the word caregivers. And this infographic shows you a summary of a study that was done almost a decade ago now, trying to look at the impact on everyday life for people who live with a rare disorder. And what they found is that 8 in 10 patients had significant difficulty completing daily tasks, whether that be personal hygiene, simple household chores, shopping, things like that. Significantly, 7 in 10 patients or their caregivers found that they either had to reduce how much they worked, meaning employed, or actually had to stop working completely because of the disease. That's a huge impact on their life. Many people have had to change, even if they can still work, they've had to change the type of work they were doing as a consequence of having the disease. And what they found is that among people who have rare disease, feelings of unhappiness or depression are 3 times as frequent as those who do not live with a rare disease. So the point is this: rare diseases impact a lot of people, and they can really change how you live life. Chronic pain is certainly associated with a lot of diseases, like arthritis, for example, but it is also a syndrome in and of itself, and it afflicts a lot of people in our country. In fact, if you were to take all of the people today that are living in chronic pain and bring them into one geographic location, they would represent a city larger than the 10 largest cities in America combined. So that would be like combining the populations of New York City and Boston and Chicago and Los Angeles and Phoenix and Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and a couple of additional ones. Add those cities all together, and the population is still smaller than the number of people that are living with chronic pain. Chronic pain is defined as having pain every day or almost every day for 3 months or longer. It is important to recognize that chronic pain is different than acute pain. You see this picture on the slide, and I presume most of you recognize very quickly that it is Stonehenge. It's an interesting site. Somebody put these rocks there. They're arranged in a special order, so they had some purpose in doing it. But who did it, how they did it, and why they did it has been lost to the annals of history. Somebody did, but we don't know who. And for many people living with chronic pain, that's analogous to the cause of their pain. We don't know why they're still in pain. Something caused their pain. But our modern diagnostic methods don't show anything physiologically wrong. It's sort of like a pebble that you throw into a pond. The pebble quickly drops below the surface and is no longer visible, but it leaves a ripple effect that goes across the surface for a long time after the pebble has disappeared from sight. Many people who are living with chronic pain can look back and speak to an injury or maybe even a surgery. But everything that we can tell with diagnostic tests, that has healed, and yet they're still living with pain. That is the experience of a large portion of the population that lives with chronic pain. The cause is unknown. And one of the consequences of that is that people question the validity of their pain, whether or not it is actually real. That's one of the things that makes it very different than acute pain. Another way that it's very different is the pattern of pain. Most people who have experienced only acute pain, what they know is that pain gets intense real quick and then slowly it gets better. That's not what happens in the experience of people who live with chronic pain. When people live with chronic pain, it varies within a day, from day to day, and week to week. The pain may never go away, but it still vacillates in intensity. Some days, a patient who lives with chronic pain will wake up and it's very hard just to get dressed and shower and begin the day because mobility hurts. Other days they wake up and they feel reasonably well. The pain is still there, but it doesn't inhibit their activities as much. And as I said, that can vary from day to day, from week to week, from month to month. Patients sometimes will have a string of days together. Well, they'll have a good week or maybe even a string of weeks, but then they'll have months on end where the intensity seems great. And this vacillation is hard to deal with, and it's especially hard for people other than the patient to understand. Family members question their claims to pain when they see that some days they can do things and other days they can't. And it creates one of the special challenges for people who live with chronic pain. And as a consequence, this pain can have broad effects on health, on mobility, on sleep, on sexual functions, and many other areas of life. This is an infographic that was created by the University of Michigan Medical Center just to try to give a sense of a summary of chronic pain. And one of the reasons why I've put it here is so that you can see the source of pain. In their findings, the most frequent area of pain for people living with chronic pain is back pain. And that's followed by headache or migraine pain and neck pain. Some other studies have actually found that headache pain is the most frequent form of chronic pain. It just depends on what population you're looking at. Overall, they've estimated that about 100 million people will experience chronic pain at some point in time in their life. So that's approaching a third of our population. Normally, at any given time, the National Institutes of Health suggests that 25 to 50 million people are living with chronic pain at any moment in time. But an even larger fraction of that have experienced chronic pain, in other words, pain for 3 months or longer at some point in time in their life. And that has huge economic implications. You can see the large number that's estimated by this group. Over $600 billion a year in lost wages, lost productivity, and healthcare costs. Now, obviously, health economists argue in different directions as to how much that dollar value is, but it's really big. Chronic pain in itself has a huge economic impact on our nation. What is important to recognize is that people who are living with chronic pain have a broken pain cycle. And what this figure shows is what the normal pain cycle is. And that is simply this. You experience an injury and it sends a pain signal. That pain signal then is perceived by your central nervous system. Healing takes place and your central nervous system actually sends out signals to dampen the pain signals. This is an active process. It's not just that the pain signals stop, but there's actually information that flows from your central nervous system that says, okay, I got the message, we're working on it, you can stop sending pain signals. But in people who live with chronic pain, something's broken. We're not sure exactly what it is. There's some ideas, but something's broken. And the pain signals don't dampen, even after an injury has healed. It would be like the fire department coming to a building that's on fire. They put out the fire and leave, but forget to turn off the fire alarm. And the residents of that building will quickly get irritated by the constant blaring of the alarm. That's what it's like to live with chronic pain. Even when healing to an injury or a surgical site has taken place, the signal about pain doesn't go away. It continues to blare. And this in itself can lead to an overall deterioration of a person's health. No other pathology in mind, just chronic pain itself can lead to a progressive deterioration in a person's overall health. And this figure is an attempt to illustrate that with back pain. When you have back pain, one of the first and very natural reactions you have is to avoid the activity that provokes the pain. Obviously, that can be protective. If you have an injury, you don't want to create further injury, and so you avoid activity, right? Well, avoiding activity, though, leads to a progressive deconditioning. What does that mean? Well, any of you have a normal exercise routine. Maybe you run or you walk, or maybe you row or you swim or you bike, whatever it might be. If you take several weeks off because of an illness, or maybe because of travel, or because your schedule has just gotten crazy, then when you return back, you can't bike as far, you can't run as fast, you can't row as long, because your body has become deconditioned. And it'll take a while before you get back up to where you were. And all of you have probably experienced that in some form or another. Well, that's what happens when you pull back on activity because of pain. You get deconditioned. And what that means is that then you will experience pain with an even lower level of activity. And what does that cause you to do? That causes you to pull back on activity further. And that causes your body to be deconditioned further. And you can see how then you enter into this vicious cycle of a continual reduction in activity as you become deconditioned, and lower levels of activity provoke pain in your body, causing you again to avoid more activity. And people can quickly become quite immobile as a result of living with persistent pain. That puts you into this vicious physical cycle. But there's also a psychological vicious cycle that people enter into. The inability to have the pain stop can produce all kinds of emotional, psychological responses: anger, anxiety, fear, distress, that leads to an overall impoverished mood and can result in depression. And we know that people who are depressed have an increased perception of pain. What does that do? That causes them to avoid activity further and promotes this. So what you can see is that these two feed off of one another. These vicious cycles of an increasingly impoverished mood and a vicious cycle of increased deconditioning in your body, leading to an overall deterioration in health, simply as a result of pain. Obviously, one of the key priorities in therapy is to break these vicious cycles so that people can get back to doing a higher level of activity, and so that people have a breakage in their impoverished mood and can begin to enjoy things in life once again. But it's really important to recognize why it is so important that we treat pain. Because if we don't, people will enter into these vicious cycles and will see their health deteriorate over time. And some of you have perhaps watched that happen in either yourself or a loved one. I hope these introductory comments have helped you to see that chronic illness and chronic pain that is often associated with it is widespread and has a tremendous impact on people's lives. And in fact, when we think about where might we encounter people who are living with chronic illness and pain, the fact is they're everywhere. They're in our families, they're in our churches, they're where we work, our community, they're everywhere. But here's something else that's important to recognize. Most people who suffer from a chronic illness have a condition that is invisible to those with whom they rub shoulders day in and day out. Most have an invisible disability. People cannot see that they're suffering physically or limited physically, except perhaps when they observe certain things they avoid doing, maybe at times seeing a sign of pain in their face, etc. But beyond that, unless they are told, they don't realize that they are struggling with the challenges of a chronic illness. They're all around us. May the Lord help us to be more sensitive to those around us. And I trust that in the weeks ahead, as we continue to study this, it will help not only those on a journey with chronic illness understand what they're experiencing more fully, but will help those who are listening and who do not have that experience as part of their lives be more empathetic and understand how to help. Let me close our time with a word of prayer. Our great glorious Creator, you are the one who makes the human body. Every single one of us. You are sovereign and you control all of our experiences. You make the deaf and the blind, you say. And so, Father, we know that anything that happens to our bodies, all of our experiences, have been sifted through your sovereign hand. And we know that you have a purpose for them all. I pray for those who are listening, Lord, that are battling day by day chronic illness. I ask, Father, that you would give them the spiritual, emotional, and physical strength to be steadfast in the midst of the trial. And Father, for those who are not themselves facing this challenge, but have family members and others that they interact with, I pray that you would give wisdom to be of support and help to those in this particular type of trial. And that all of us, Father, would be reminded that we have a Savior who is touched by our infirmities and who knows the experience of suffering more than we could ever even imagine. And he is a sympathetic high priest. And to him we can turn for comfort and help. And we ask all of these things in his precious name. Amen.